work. She's been doing extremely relevant research on gender and the history of science. And the present series is extremely appropriate because she's in a session in which not only the gaze and the look, but also museums have a prominent space. She has been the trustee of the National Portrait Gallery and National Museum of the Science and Industry. She's, among others, well known to at least to persons by me who are working on the history of the historiography for a book on history and practice. And she has just finished a book on the look of the past, and I'm sure she's going to introduce us to this new chapter of a very important scholarly work. So, Ludmilla, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for your very kind introduction, and I know all the visitors will share my wish to thank you for the very kind hospitality that we've received here. As I think Carlotta said yesterday, I was very excited to receive the invitation. And I feel slightly mortified that the book hasn't actually come out. I was hoping that it would be out. And I asked the press if they would prepare a special sheet for me to bring to the conference. And then this morning I left it in my hotel room. I'm very sorry. I'll bring it later on. And it just simply tells you the details and lists what the chapters are about. And obviously, I hope people will read it with interest. It's a pleasure and an honour to be here and to address you this morning. So, as I've just explained, my thoughts today arise from a project I've recently completed, which arises in turn out of many years of trying to use visual and material culture in my own research, and at the same time trying to reflect upon both the problems and the potential of doing so. So in The Look of the Past, Visual and Material Evidence in Historical Practice, I set myself the goal of laying out what I took to be the main issues that arise for historians when we use visual and or material sources. And I organised the book in terms of 5 conceptual chapters, and in between the chapters there are short essays about specific things, a building, a piece of... Oh yes, could we have
Sure.
less light and... So...
Non è abbastanza, no?
Okay. So this building, no, I think it's not. This piece of sculpture, which you will all know, a photography exhibition, which is this, and looking particularly at this part of it, and a portrait. So there are these short essays which are interspersed with the broader conceptual reflections, as I said, and one of these chapters concerns periodization, which is a theme I consider to be especially pertinent to our concerns here. It would be neither possible nor desirable to summarise the book's arguments on this occasion, although naturally I draw upon them in what follows. I used examples from the period 1600 onwards, because I have observed that medievalists, like ancient historians, have been considerably more adept than those who work on later periods at practicing the kinds of integrative history that I advocate in the book. And it has often seemed to me ironic that those historians whose visual sources are most plentiful so often use them unthinkingly, as if they merely illustrated points established by other means, served as decoration or provided intellectual comfort breaks. This integrative ideal implies, by the way, that academic specialization and fragmentation is problematic, even disabling, that all kinds of historians are concerned with and can benefit from using visual and material evidence, just as those who specialize in deploying such evidence can benefit from engaging with economic, political, and diplomatic history, for example. In the Look at the Past, I certainly discussed topics such as modernism and the rise of photography that have been central to received views about the role of visual experience, or roles, I should say, of visual experience in so-called modern times. However, I do not assume that there are self-evident discontinuities between 1600 and the present day. When it comes to writing histories of looking, we might want to think afresh about our assumptions concerning periodization. One obvious example is the role of physiognomy, a delineated form of knowledge since ancient times, which enjoyed renewed significance in the 19th century, both in general culture and in medical contexts. In the case of medicine, physiognomy had never ceased to be integral to clinical procedures and practice. Arguably, it remains central to medical activities, although it is no longer deemed a distinct subject. The historical issues here, then, are about forms of systematization within medical training, institutions, publications, and so on. It is undeniable that photography, for example, brought with it the possibility of fresh forms of systematization, although the visual idioms it deployed, for example, in asylum records, were not new. I'm just showing you one example of the famous series of works by a photographer called Hugh Welch Diamond, and this is from around 1855, and this is in the Getty collection. So since we are thinking at the conference about future agendas for historical work, I would like to suggest that reflecting critically on assumptions about periodization and on the characteristics and pace of change with the nature of vision specifically in mind should come high on the agenda. I accept these are huge issues, and much depends on the historical models we most admire and incorporate into our work. It might be said, for example, that Michael Baxendall's approach works best for those of us who are interested in and drawn to what I would see as a horizontal mode of address to the past. I mean to suggest a concern with contemporaneous phenomena that assist in the understanding of visual evidence and vice versa. So an interesting example of this for me would be his work on shadows and the Enlightenment, where he makes a move that he would quite often make, which would be to say, so what theories, what preoccupations, what conceptual frameworks make sense of this particular kind of visual evidence? It's the same kind of move that he makes in the famous discussion of the Chardin painting, A Lady Taking Tea. But this mode can hardly be sufficient for the kinds of longue durée history that I am implicitly advocating here, and which in an ideal world would complement more temporally focused studies. Now, I do not want to make this a talk in general about how to do such longue durée history while placing visual materials and experiences at the centre of our research. But I did want to pick up one possible way of doing so that was mentioned in the original call for papers. And perhaps I can evoke this by simply using the phrase visualization of the past, mentioned under the heading Images and the Past. So elements from earlier times can have extremely long lives and be constantly refreshed or revivified, as we know from work on neoclassicism, for example. And here I'm not thinking of traditional art historical works on neoclassicism, but the sort of thing that someone called Vicky Coltman does in a book she published about 3 or 4 years ago, which is a much more historical attempt to understand what it might mean to invoke the notion of neoclassicism in the 18th century. Now, so what I'm invoking here is the phrase images and the past. But we know that and is a very weak word. So I'd like to explore for a moment ways of thinking about images and the past that give it force, that give more force to that association. The call for papers suggested that this theme became especially important at the beginning of the 19th century. I would argue that it has always been and remains important. It is true that we might, with Stephen Bann, for example, think about the early 19th century interest in medieval remains. Or again, with him and with Mark Salva Phillips, consider the ways in which historical subjects were painted over the 19th century. But the trends they have charted need to be seen in a broader context, a longer durée. Furthermore, we might wish to think about the ways in which the production of art and artifacts is necessarily historical, and about the visual repertoire available at any given moment for thinking about and representing forebears. Then it is helpful to recognise that practices of copying and producing derivative prints were highly diverse in terms of the audiences and markets they reached, and that this made the 18th century too a mediatic society. I am fully persuaded that there was what the call for papers called an inflation of images over the 19th century, manifest particularly vividly, I would argue, in the use and production of postcards. And obviously I was thrilled to hear some papers which used postcards yesterday. This is an album in the collection of Cambridge University Library, and I use it in the book, and I used it here because it suggests something of the actual use of postcards, not a disembodied postcard. And you'll notice that the paper has clearly been cut in an amateur way. So this is a notebook prepared by a man who travelled all around the Indian Ocean, and he kept a diary, I surmise for an older relative, and he bought a notebook and he cut himself the pictures and then he added commentary. And I am very interested in this in particular because of course it contains a postcard that might be thought of as quintessentially and perhaps rather unpleasantly, quote, Orientalist. But you'll notice that the frame in which it's set, the metaphorical frame, suggests perhaps a slightly more complex reading. Can I just say that certainly in British archives there are thousands of these things. And I think one of the problems which I'm going to allude to in a moment is there's so much of this kind of material that I think it's very hard to know how as historians we might make sense of it. And I was allowed access to their albums collection, most of which are not even catalogued. So I feel the need to confess at this point a bit of a missionary zeal to suggest that we should be making friends with archivists in places like Cambridge University Library would say, take me to your tower, which they also allowed me to do, to look through the ephemera collection. And I think the kinds of materials that are in such collections are extraordinarily rich. So forgive my missionary moment. Now, I want to interpret this in a bigger historical context, not least to understand where these practices and their associated visual skills came from. Thus, however hotly contested the notion has been, the so-called print revolution has to be part of this story, not least because it was in and through prints that audiences constituted themselves as such. Thus, I take works like these rather seriously, and I'm just going to show you a suite of prints which are about the nature of audiences. Because however comical they are, I think they are premised on the audience being an audience, on seeing themselves as viewers, spectators, beholders, and, if you like, as gazers. And again, these have been used quite a lot by historians, and I'm particularly interested in prints that show print shops, because it does seem clear that people go to print shops however little money they have. So this is Gilray's Very Slippy Weather from 1808, and this is Carrington Bowles, 1774, Spectators at a Print Shop, and this is the Macaroni Print Shop, 1772, and finally, and I'm sorry for the associated stuff, this is how it comes off the British Museum website. Of course, major people like Ackerman, of course, are drawing attention to themselves. So here is Ackerman publishing 1809, a print of his own print shop with people looking at prints. So it's this kind of phenomenon that I'm interested in. So a history of vision seeks to reconstruct the places, not just where vision came up, since that's everywhere, but where it played a constitutive role, and I like to suggest that religion is one of the most obvious examples, taking account of the skills, behaviours, and social formations it implies at any given place and time. And it's for this reason that I refer to physiognomy, because it's an easy way to remind ourselves how a number of visual skills were taken for granted and contested over many centuries and articulated from time to time in texts as well as in other media. But I could actually just as well have said natural theology, a type of study and knowledge which implies that we scrutinize the natural world as the most magnificent and awe-inspiring artworks of God, which expressed a concern with the nature of vision that encompassed visual skills, the art of description, the cultivation of veneration through looking, and so on. Natural theology, like physiognomy, could be seen as stressing the immediacy of skilled vision, to use a phrase that has been explored in an anthropological context in a fascinating book of essays edited by Cristina Graceni, and it explores its centrality in the here and now of many societies. Now, we know that natural theology was central to public discourse in Britain in the first half of the 18th century. And the point I'm making here is that we often associate natural theology with the 17th and 18th centuries, but actually it was a major part of public life. And I'm afraid I failed to find a visual example, but there was a man called Charles Bell who wrote a Bridgewater treatise. He worked consistently with artists. He was a surgeon. He worked consistently with artists in the early 19th century. So if we're interested in public culture, this is a major part of public culture. Now, a few moments ago, however, I invoked the phrase visualization of the past from the call for papers as a major theme. And I'd like to develop that point a bit more by keeping the past bit more in focus. My comments indicated that we might think of this theme at a number of levels. One level might be the explicit representation and/or display of the past. So I have a particular interest in the construction of heroism, which is a central theme in 19th and 20th century culture, of course. And I have observed how, over the 19th century, medical relics were assembled and statues erected in a distinctive manner in order to celebrate the achievements of a small number of outstanding individuals. And this is, I think, a rather interesting example. Obviously, I'd love to talk more about this, but this is a mid-19th century statue by a reasonably prominent sculptor, and it shows William Harvey, who discovered the circulation of the blood, studied in Padua, of course, and it shows him in a sort of self-consciously sort of royalist, I would say, not just 17th century, but royalist visual mode. And he was, of course, a royal physician. But another way of thinking about this might be the way in which people cast themselves into earlier times. So although dressing up and representing the results is one very important manifestation of this, think of the vogue for historical pageants in the early 20th century, for example, or the history of costume drama in film, which the V&A is about to do a major exhibition on. I would argue that self-portraiture is a major arena in which we can think about such matters. And I have a little... So we have Joshua Reynolds with Michelangelo. We have Joseph Wright of Derby also pretending to be in the 17th century. And we have Vigée Lebrun paying homage to Rubens. We might also, these are well known, this is rather less well known. I'll explain what this is in a moment. Sorry about the animal, they wouldn't let me have any other version. So we might characterize these in terms of a double or even a triple gaze. And remember that here we see James Northcote painting the man, Walter Scott, whose works, many of which were historical, after all, enjoyed extraordinary social and geographical reach while casting himself as Titian. So Northcote, the painter here, also wrote a biography of Titian. And although I haven't been able to discover the origins of this, the hat that he's wearing is customarily referred to in this period. So this is late 1820s as a Titian cap. So my wider point is that both self-portraiture as a genre and the changes it undergoes may offer fruitful possibilities for pursuing gazing societies over significant periods of time, because key themes are pulled so forcefully into the foreground, and because self-portraiture has been a recognizable genre for many centuries, artists are in conversation with earlier manifestations. That is to say, they are being, in an elaborate sense, historical. And this brings me to a third level, how historicity is built into production itself. So few of those who make artifacts are self-taught, and even those that are have their visual experience of items made in earlier times upon which to draw, if with varying degrees of self-awareness. The transmission of skills is, if you like, a form of visual and material history, which becomes available for explicit historical analysis through physical objects. But the phrase transmission of skills refers to only some of the phenomena I have in mind. Those who make items that are valued generally have high levels of historical awareness. Thus, however oppositional they are in many layered conversations between past, present, and there are many layered conversations between past, present, and future embedded in their practices. Now, I stress all this for a particular reason. When we work on the 19th and 20th centuries, we have to deal with the too much stuff problem. While it is ubiquity that makes visual culture such an important zone for historians, that very ubiquity poses intellectual challenges, especially if we have the integrative goals that I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. What I called a horizontal approach produces precisely this problem. Is it possible to undertake a rigorous study that includes and integrates photographs, buildings, fashion, design, and so on? Now, obviously, I feel we have to say yes to this question, but then it becomes necessary to experiment with ways of actually making such a project viable. Now, you'll appreciate that I'm actually making the specialization and fragmentation point in another way. Scholarly communities like museums, galleries, and auction houses tend to divide visual culture according to various kinds of mélange of genre, medium, place, and period. And to do so makes everyone's life easier. But it makes horizontality and integration, as well as generating longue durée perspectives, that much harder. And I remain curious about what, for example, a modern history would look like that fully integrated coins, medals, cutlery, and weapons, to just take 4 categories of metalware. As I pointed out earlier, such an approach is rather more common among those working on earlier periods, but considerably less so among modern historians. I remain confident it can be done, for example, in the spirit of Chris Bailey's magisterial The Birth of the Modern World, subtitled Global Connections and Comparisons, which covers the period 1780 to 1914. And its concerns are neither visual nor material culture, although they are present in his account, and I think actually in some very interesting ways. But I am fully aware of the monumental abilities and energies that to do work on that kind of scale requires. So one alternative, at least for the moment, has been implicit in much of what I have said. That is, examining domains, case studies, and occasions where vision itself is thematized. I have implied, for example, that medicine and its representations, broadly defined, is one such realm, and that so are many other areas of the sciences. It remains worth remembering in this context the alacrity and enthusiasm with which practitioners of science and medicine embrace the new medium of photography. Depictions of those looking and being looked at are another example. I used the term audiences earlier, and I am well aware that it is not ideal given its etymological pedigree, but I have been unable to come up with a better one. So a history of depictions in a range of media, if possible, of people looking and gazing seems to me an interesting idea. It would encompass not only the print I showed earlier, but also grand tour imagery, paintings, photographs, and prints of shows, demonstrations, exhibitions, and spectators, self-portraiture clearly, material generated by the great exhibitions, and so on. And I'm just going to show a couple of examples. Now, I chose this, I don't know, this is also from, this is from the Met. This is by the Swiss artist Louis Ducrot. Now, the fact is, Ducrot, this is not what I wanted, but the one I wanted, which was of the Laocoon, it wasn't in a sufficiently high-resolution size. So it's not so much that Ducrot always shows people paying close visual attention, although in most of his pictures there are. What's so interesting about this is that he sold his etching. So this is an etching, watercolor, and gouache. He sold his etchings to grand tourists so that they could add extra bits themselves. That is, they presumably bought prints of places they had seen. They bought a representation, so there's a second level, and then third, they added to the scene themselves in an intense visual encounter. So it's those layers that interested me about this example in particular. And we're going to come on to this, I'm sure a lot of you recognise this. So for me, it would be necessary to pay close attention to works of art in this context. For example, in the way that Susan Siegfried does in what I think is a wonderful book on Louis Leopold Boilly. And we see here his pictures of a group of artists in an artist studio from 1798. Or indeed, as I think Timothy Barringer does in his very different but nonetheless brilliant book, Men at Work. So in effect, I'm claiming that the history of art is central to the practice of history in general. Now, I think there are two reasons for historians to embrace art, however problematic some see the term as being. The first is that so-called high art represents exceedingly refined and sophisticated forms of thinking, from which historians learn a very great deal. And can I just say, I wrote this before I heard Tim's lecture yesterday, but obviously and I'd like to thank him for developing a lot of the themes so eloquently yesterday. It may be considered, as I said earlier, a distinctive form of testimony to which we do well to pay attention. The second, of course, is that art history as a discipline has a range of intellectual resources to offer to historians, even if they do not consider what they study to be art. Now, clearly, the organisers of this conference do not need to be persuaded at this point, given their choice of plenary speakers, so I'm not going to labour the point. But I might express it another way, in terms of what historians learn from debates within all the fields that specialise in using visual sources, which I think is about how and with what consequences one pays attention while gazing and then turns it to analytical effect. More specifically, the high levels of historical awareness, by which I mean a sense of the past, among those who produce visual culture is particularly evident in the case of so-called elite art, and hence for me its distinctive value in historical practice, that is, for historiography. Now, for many working historians who equate elite with unable to yield historical insights, my argument would seem unpersuasive. So I am keen to show how the analysis of seemingly elite forms of culture can nonetheless be turned to good and general historical effect. And I think that one way of doing this is to put pressure on the very notion of elite. For example, servants and retainers were arguably the most numerous audience for aristocratic collections. Thus, their visual fields were far richer than is sometimes assumed. And so what I'm suggesting is that these are the same people who then go into churches, for example, and will be interpreting the visual culture that they see around them. So bridging between art and other phenomena is what much excellent art history does. But I notice that certainly in the circles I move in, relatively few ordinary historians, if I may put it that way, would think it part of their historical responsibility to read extensively in art history. And I mean, I would like to see art historians basically making it compulsory for the general run of historians to read in art history. Until that utopian moment arrives, we need more bridges, and I think also to recognise openly and honestly the difficulties to be faced in constructing those bridges. And what I'm arguing is that probing the historical awareness inside art is perhaps one way forward. But I accept that we need more than this in order to cultivate a rich understanding of what looking involves and of both the visual and textual forms through which one may speak about the nature of vision. And I just wanted to give you what I think is a brilliant example of what one could do, partly because one of my postdocs is working on him, which is the Irish painter William Orpen. And I'm interested in him. So, sorry, there isn't time to explain all of this, but this is a painting from This is a painting from 1901, which is called A Mere Fracture. And it turns out that the participants who posed for this are a mixture of artists and doctors, and that the person who posed as the patient was someone who was thought to look exceedingly like Orpen himself. So there's an extremely elaborate discussion going on here about the nature of artistic and medical looking. Now, Orpen's circle, as I've implied, included medical practitioners, some of whom were also artists, but he was actually taught by Henry Tonks, who was himself both a surgeon and an artist. Orpen consistently explored themes of close visual examination, not only using medical themes as here, but in his self-portraits, and I think this is particularly interesting. This is a self-portrait from 1910, so the use of the convex mirror, which he does a lot in his work. But I also included this because this is another self-portrait from exactly the same period. So I think this gives you some sense of the range of visual repertoires that he's using, and his interest in mirrors, which is absolutely constant. But if we turn to his teacher, Henry Tonks, who, can I just remind you, was a surgeon who was also active in the First World War. Before the war, Tonks produced this of 1892 called The Hat Shop, which also seems to me to be a disquisition, if of a very different kind, on the nature of looking, and I've become very interested in depictions of shops and shopping, because it seems to me that, again, extraordinarily rich historically. So here we have the mirrors, windows, and ways of looking. But if I can be a bit provocative, we might want to consider this in the context of his other work, including his pastels, which are simultaneously sympathetic and unflinching, depicting facial injuries inflicted during the First World War. And I just want to pay homage to my postdoc, who's called Karen Hammerschlag, a Courtauld trained art historian, who, as I say, is currently working on Orpen. Now, in fact, there is a theme connected with visual attention that unites much of what I've been saying so far, and that is actually connoisseurship and its history, not least by virtue of the importance of Giovanni Morelli, who was medically trained and certainly a figure of major significance for our concerns at this conference. My take on connoisseurship, which is sometimes even said with an air of distaste, is that it has been a historical phenomenon of such centrality that we simply cannot afford to ignore it. And certainly in my work of 18th century figures, I found it indispensable, and especially thinking about the social contexts in which we might understand connoisseurship. But my interest here is specifically in the depiction of connoisseurs, that is, in the visual languages that were available for representing highly skilled close looking and the historical insights these might afford us. So in the book that I've just finished, there is an essay on this work from 1908, and I have found it particularly good to think with. Much to my surprise, as I was sharing with Tim yesterday, I'm one of those people who doesn't even like Renoir, but there we go. So this is one of a number of portraits that Renoir painted of one of his dealers, Ambroise Vollard, and it was bought by Samuel Courtauld for his collection in 1927. At one level, its subject matter is clear enough: visual and tactile appreciation. The object Vollard is holding in his hands and which absorbs him was made by another of his artists, Aristide Maillol. Thus, it will be possible to interpret this particular artistic commentary on looking and making in terms of a set of social, professional, economic and aesthetic relationships. For example, Maillol had sculpted a head of Renoir, who admired his work, and himself produced sculpture with the help of someone who had previously worked with Maillol. Vollard had made money out of both men and in a variety of ways. Vollard published on Renoir. We might say he published portraits of Renoir, and that these are worth noting. We might just as well think of this work as concerned with the audiences for Maillol's work, both inside and outside the canvas. And then we might explore the role of hands, a subject in which Renoir was certainly interested. And I mentioned Charles Bell earlier on when I was talking about natural theology, because he published a treatise on the hand, and I wanted to just suggest that that might be another way in which we might take some of these long lines. And inevitably, there could be a simple account of this picture in terms of men's pleasure in female bodies. These are hardly mutually exclusive avenues, although I think that to see this work as primarily a depiction of lasciviousness is a tad simplistic. In the end, Vollard's capacity to look extremely carefully at something that has been artfully made takes centre stage. Now, those who have written on the painting tend to acknowledge this when they locate it within traditions of portraits of connoisseurs, traditions that are invoked rather than meticulously documented. And I'm thinking of comment here, of comments by the late John House and by Colin Bailey. This is a comparison that Bailey found persuasive with Titian's Jacopo Strada of 1567. In The Look of the Past, I argue that this is both historically and art historically extremely wide of the mark, and that rather than turn to a picture concerning opulence, display and learning, produced nearly 350 years earlier, we might rather consider traditions of looking and depicting with which Renoir was more likely to be familiar. And specifically, I suggest turning to Honoré Daumier. One of his works on a related theme was sold 3 times in Renoir's lifetime, passing once through the hands. Sorry, this is just to keep reminding you of the picture that we're thinking about of this man, Paul Durand-Ruel, who was also one of Renoir's dealers. I've lost. This is it. Sorry. So this is the work. So sold 3 times, once by someone with whom Renoir was in direct contact. This which is in the Met is simply one example of Daumier's preoccupation with the theme of looking and diverse visual responses, which was marked in the 1860s, at which time Renoir was in his 20s and therefore likely to have known about it. Now, obviously, if there were more time, one would then do a close reading of Daumier's work, and there isn't time for this, but this is just to suggest the type of argument that one might make. Now, and you'll be pleased to hear we're nearly coming to the end. I recognise that there are 2 aspects of these arguments that may appear to be limited. Now, the first is that in fact, of course, all art bears on the history of vision. This is perfectly obvious, since it is composed in a historically precise manner to address specific visual possibilities, and by this token necessarily engages with gauging societies, their skills, habits and assumptions. Thus, it is not logically necessary, simply neat and rhetorically compelling to turn to works that explicitly thematize vision. Such works may assist in bridge building between history as a discipline and those fields that have developed specialized expertise in visual analysis. A history of vision should indeed concern any areas of the past that are relevant, and there are few subjects on which it has no bearing, whilst there are some, and I've suggested that religion is one such, where it is absolutely central. The second potential limitation concerns the relationships between individual and collective looking practices. Renoir's portrait of Vollard was produced within a highly circumscribed social context. Are we entitled to generalize from it at all? Well, obviously I'm going to say yes and no. But to ask this question immediately raises a query about the role of case studies in the kinds of work this conference seeks to promote. So let me put the point the other way around. Without highly focused case studies that combine, if I may adopt the terminology we have sometimes deployed in the history of science, both internalist and externalist analysis, it will be impossible to develop big historical pictures about gazing societies and the ways in which they have changed. So effectively what I'm saying is we have to have these kinds of very close case studies, and therefore we have to try and work out how these, what may seem rather particular, very tight instances can be made to articulate with broader historical phenomena. The more such case studies explicitly focus on the nature of vision, the easier it becomes to generate broad accounts of change over the longer term. And this is why studying certain categories of art, including, I should say, public art, are particularly fruitful. A history of vision of the kind I believe the organisers of this conference envisage would certainly reflect on the kinds of looking collectivities that may be found at given times and places, rather as James Johnson asked about audiences for music in Listening in Paris, and as historians of theatre, the music hall and film think about the changing audiences and audience experiences that these genres produced. The apparently private compact between Renoir and Vollard remains revealing, especially when viewed in the comparative context of Renoir's other visual accounts of him. Some of you may know the famous Toreador, which shows Vollard dressed up as a Spanish toreador, and of other dealers like Durand-Ruel, conservative, Catholic. I mean, it's absolutely there in the picture, it seems to me. And of other renderings of Vollard and of other dealers by a range of artists. And here again, we might come back to the zone that Tim was talking about yesterday and think about Picasso's Cubist portraits. The close texture of dealer-artist relationships is but one element of the modern art world, whilst another is the images and practices of connoisseurship, however vexed the term. So I hope you will see my slide of Berenson in 1955 in the Villa Borghese as a kind of humorous commentary on the complexities of the concept of connoisseurship. Thus, I have argued, that there are a huge array of places and ways in which looking is thrown into sharp relief, and it seems worthwhile to put as many of them together in the scholar's mind. What remains central for me is that historians develop as precise a sense as possible of how and why they engage with visual materials. And this requires a simultaneous interest in conceptualization and case studies. And also, I have hinted, a critical stance on matters of periodization. The sheer volume of visual materials demands modes of address that do not sacrifice meticulous attention to their physical properties, and that do not unthinkingly follow the divisions of genre, medium, and value that work against types of historical understanding that are genuinely integrative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ludmilla, for your very inspiring lecture, and I think all of us are having on mind lots of reactions, and we will have a chance of coming back to the main issues you raised, I think, in many ways in the following discussions. But even given our strict schedule, I would propose to have 10 minutes for questions short before the coffee break, and more I think we will have time to discuss maybe tomorrow and today in the discussion. But please, Alberto Banti, please, I would like to see if anybody else would like to. Alberto, would you like to come here? It's easier for me to translate.
So thank you very much for your lecture, but I was thinking, do you think agency or agencies have some relevance in the analysis of the study of the images in the past? I think, do you think there is a legitimacy in asking who does produce what and for which reasons? Or who does suggest to produce something for which reasons? Thinking of Michael Baxendale in his analysis of 14, 15 Florence, I remember that Baxendale put some emphasis on the role of church as the main agent in producing images in this context. So, do you think that is relevant to that?
Thank you. That's a brilliant question, because that's one of the main themes of my book, is about how historians can think about agency in relation to visual and material culture. So I hope that everything I implied was about agency, not just literally, that is, who commissions, who makes, who buys, who sells, who looks, who uses. I'm very interested in the fact that a lot of visual culture in the past has been cut up or manipulated or written. There was a fantastic exhibition in Edinburgh a few years ago of Rubens' collections of Old Master drawings, which showed that Rubens drew over his Old Master drawings, which to us is so extraordinarily difficult to understand. So I think that's one way of imagining, even there, how complete the agent or how extensive the agency is. But I'm also interested in agency figuratively speaking. So I suppose a book that we might look to, although I have to confess, I find it very, very difficult, would be Alfred Gell's Art and Agency, which is one way in which I think certainly for those of us who like to talk a lot to anthropologists, these questions of agency have been put into a wider domain. So I very much hope nothing I said implied that I wasn't interested in agency. It's just that I didn't cast it in those terms because, you know, we only had an hour. You can't talk about everything, but I think agency is absolutely fundamental. I also think it's one of the places where the most difficult theoretical questions come up, especially for historians. It seems to me one of the things in art history is that one can talk about artists and people don't get uncomfortable about what it is that artists do. But certainly in the more general, I mean, I practice now in a history department, and I think a lot of my colleagues have very different notions of agency. So that's why I raised the question of individual and collective audiences. And by the way, one of the things, I have a whole chapter in the book on audiences, and I begin it by telling the story of the Family of Man exhibition going to Moscow, which it did, obviously was an American Cold War enterprise. And in Moscow, a Nigerian student who was studying in Russia pulled down some of the photographs which showed African subjects. And he explained why he did this. So I try in the book, you'll have to see if, I'm sure I don't do it well enough, but I have a go at trying to say agency is absolutely everywhere. And audiences, I'm very invested in the idea that audiences are active and not passive. So, thank you.
Well, that was, of course, a totally wonderful presentation, and it's always great to hear a historian kind of preaching the gospel of art history, one could say, because I think we don't hear it enough, so thank you for that. When you just mentioned this issue of a Cold War project on the Family of Man, it sparked one of my questions of the presentation, which had to do with periodization. Because for me, to say Cold War project implies something about periodization that first I would say is, for me, false about the Family of Man project, that I see it as a project of liberal humanism, which dates back, which dates back to the pre-war period, but it's always been reintegrated, you know, in the post-war era as Cold War precisely by historians who are more interested in things like the Cold War than they are in, say, the role of the photo essay, etc. So I wanted to bring back to you your provocative comment about periodization and ask you to elaborate.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. No, that's brilliant. Just what I would have expected. So absolutely, this is a project of liberal humanism, and in the chapter on the Family of Man, I talk a lot about Dorothea Lange, and who is absolutely not to be seen in a Cold War context. And I try very hard not to label the Family of Man. I mean, this is also, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, a project about which there's been an enormous amount of negative commentary, going back right to the early time when people, I showed, the slide I showed of the opening from the Family of Man book includes a picture by a photographer called Robert Frank, and he was particularly scathing, even though his work was included. And he is the reason why I can't have that spread in my book, because the policy is that his work should never appear on the same page as the work of any other artist, even though the 1955 book on the Family of Man has never been out of print. So actually, I think another thing we should be taking on as historians and art historians is the capacity to reproduce images and under what context and how this affects our reading, but I digress. So the Family of Man has always received a fair amount of negative commentary, and I actually very much wanted to reinstate it, and I make a lot of play of exactly what Vanessa has said about the liberal humanism, and indeed about the involvement of the poet Carl Sandburg, who was Steichen's brother-in-law, and who gave, from his biography of Lincoln, the title of the book. So those liberal historical antecedents it is impregnated in every page of the book. So you're absolutely right, and I try very hard not to periodize it in a sort of slick way. However, When the family of man toured internationally, I think it toured in a context that was understood by participants as Cold War. Now, and I'm drawing on the work of a man called Eric Sandine, who's written a book about this. So I really appreciate Vanessa asking me about it, because I think that suggests how incredibly careful you have to be. So I talk a little tiny bit about this, but I certainly try not to present the family of man as a Cold War project, and she's absolutely right, it is not that. And I suppose I deal with these questions of periodization by a quite lengthy discussion about the concept of style, and whether style is interesting and useful to historians, and actually I suggest that it is. But that it has to be embedded within a very critical framework. And I use the Bernini example to say, in that case, how does it help us as historians to say, as people often do about Teresa, she's Baroque. Even in guidebooks, she's very Baroque. And so what I argue is that we really have to turn away from those kinds of periodization, whilst also seeing what kind of analytical purchase we get out of concepts of style.
Very much.